A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Hey, get ready for some deeper insights over this coming hour into the effects of the rise of anti-Semitism on the Jewish community in Australia, with one of the most prominent faces of the Jewish community. We've all seen the footage and the commentary over the past year. Protesters at the Sydney Opera House just after the October 7th, 2023 Hamas terror attack on Israelis that took 1,200 lives and hundreds of hostages taken into Gaza. And since then, the impact of rising anti-Semitism has been profound. Imagine Australian Jewish families who are no longer feeling safe at school or on university campuses, and Jewish families who've had to limit their children's activities for their safety and keeping them from threats of violence. Well, Dr. David Adler is our special guest today. He is president of the Australian Jewish Association. He's an active member of Sydney's Orthodox Jewish community. He's a popular speaker and advocate for Israel. And Dr. David Adler, let me say a special welcome along to 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and always good to talk to you. We don't do it enough.
We don't do it enough, and maybe this will be a turning point and we'll get you on a little more often, because I know that the Christian community that listens to this radio ministry has a special affinity with Israel. And I want to start let's just go into the deep end right at the start. What are you hearing, David, from your people, the Jewish community, and how they're handling disturbing levels of anti-Semitic extremism right here, emerging on our shores in Australia?
Well, Neil, to say that the Jewish community is in a state of shock is not an exaggeration. And that shock is in three levels. Obviously, what happened in Israel on the 7th of October, the biggest slaughter of Jewish people in one day since the Holocaust, and many members of the Australian Jewish community have friends and family in Israel. I personally had a cousin who was at the Nova Music Festival, a young woman who was murdered by Hamas on the 7th of October. So that's one level of shock. But locally, there have been two other levels of shock. In your introduction, you alluded to the scenes in front of the Opera House, which happened on the 9th of October. Almost immediately, we saw this spread of anti-Semitism across Australia, which we didn't ever expect. We're aware that there was some rumbling anti-Semitism, but to see it explode on the streets, on the universities, Jewish businesses being attacked, various threats made to Jewish people, the security levels that have been required have been escalated. So that's one level of shock locally, and another, very disturbingly, has been the failure of our government and law enforcement authorities to deal with it. Some of the policies that have come out from the Australian Labor federal government has actually poured fuel on the fires, and the university administrations have been woeful. Today we're speaking on Thursday, the 31st of October. And if you were to have a look at the Jerusalem Post today, you will see that the subject of anti-Semitism in Australian universities is featured. And I'm one of the people quoted in that article. So Australia's reputation in the Jewish world and internationally as formerly having been a tolerant society, but now having turned on its Jewish community, has made international news repeatedly. We are holding on to the hope, Neil, to give it a bit of optimism, that there is actually a silent majority of reasonable people, the sort of people who might listen to your program, average Aussies all over the place. We get many positive messages of support as well. And the hope is that the radical groups that we see on the streets, etc., don't represent real Australian values.
First of all, just let me acknowledge the pain that you must be suffering personally, having lost a cousin at that Nova Music Festival, and I wasn't aware of that until you've shared that now, and I know listeners will feel a certain sense of certainly sympathy for you, and of course so many others who lost family members. All of the things that you're talking about, we'll unpack some of those as we go. It's just dawned on me, though, and perhaps it shouldn't have just dawned on me, but today, as you say, it is the 31st of October, and it is also an anniversary day when Australian light horsemen were a part of the charge that liberated Beersheba. And really led the way to, in some, I'm interesting how you would see that, but leading the way to the formation of a Jewish state. That is a significant anniversary in itself, isn't it?
Neil, I'm delighted you've raised that, because Australians are rightly proud of the ANZACs. And ANZAC Day, of course, is a terribly important moment on the Australian calendar. But if you ask the average Aussie what comes into their mind when you mention Anzac Day, most people will reflexly think of Gallipoli. And I'm sure the young Anzacs fought bravely at Gallipoli, but the truth is it was a disaster. A lot of lives were lost for no gain, and eventually the Anzacs were forced to retreat. They were redeployed to a couple of the fronts, including North Africa, Egypt, under British command. And one of the missions that they were given was to play a leadership role, frankly, in the liberation of the Holy Land, as the mission was called at the time. And one of the greatest victories of World War I was the last charge of the Australian Light Horse Brigade at Beersheba. If anybody goes to Israel, you can actually follow the Anzac Trail that they went on, and there is a small museum, a wonderful little museum to the Anzacs in Beersheba. They're regarded as heroes. So my view is that when we consider Anzac Day and its important commemorations and celebrations, by all means remember those that lost their lives at Gallipoli. But I think that we should also celebrate their success. And their biggest success was at Beersheba. It did open the road to Jerusalem. It was a very important turning point, and about 6 weeks later, the Allies marched through the gate to liberate Jerusalem.
Yes, and really wonderful to reflect on that, because there is something there that forges relationship with the Jewish people for the Australian nation, and for a lot of those Anzacs that went ashore at Gallipoli, and so many lives lost, and that time being a forging of an Australian character, not because of victory, but because of the losses in the defeat. But many of those were deployed to Egypt and were a part of that light horse that did help the charge on Beersheba, and as you say, opened up that passageway to Jerusalem. Hey, we could talk about that a lot.
Neil, let me add one point, that perhaps Australia's greatest military man, Sir John Monash, who had a number of commands in World War I, he was Jewish, and Monash University is named in his honour. And one of his principles was that those involved in the Australian Jewish community owe a duty of service to Australia, and that's been an ethos ever since.
We've got so much to talk about. I want to come back to what's happened over this past year. since the October 7 terror attack, and the challenge of a propaganda war. Of course, you've got Israel and a war with Hamas. Gaza, the focal point. Now there's war with Hezbollah in the north and the tensions, and you could say war with Iran. But the propaganda war here, the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia, perhaps because there is a very strong propaganda push from those pro-Palestinian forces, and there's the necessary response from a Jewish perspective too. What are your thoughts about where people are getting their information about what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, Neil, we are outnumbered, vastly outnumbered, and to be honest, we in some fields we have been losing the public relations war. But I'll give you a really important underlying reason to think about, and that is the decline of our education system. Many people don't even have knowledge of basic history. It is actually the Jewish people that are indigenous to the land of Israel. And it's very, very easy to prove that. Even if you're not a religious person, you should know about the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You can go to Hebron, to the cave of the patriarchs, and stand alongside the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can look out on the eastern side of the old city of Jerusalem, and you'll see the Mount of Olives. And on the Mount of Olives are the ancient Jewish graves. You may have heard of the various prominent kingdoms in the former kingdom of Israel, King Saul, King David, King Solomon. King Solomon, of course, built the first temple on the Temple Mount, Har Habayit in Jerusalem. And for those who lean to the political left, let me make it clear that the sovereignty established by those kings in the Kingdom of Israel has never been ceded. So there seems to be a gross ignorance of the actual history. And when such an ignorance occurs, it creates a vacuum into which falsehood can be placed. And so the falsehoods that have been placed in the minds of the young people, particularly at universities and in schools, is an ideology contrary to the history of history and ethics. And it's the Palestinians that are, and well, yeah, Jews from Judea. The whole concept of Palestinian as a distinct separate people was something invented in 1964 on the advice of the KGB to Yasser Arafat when he led the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So having a lack of knowledge of ancient history, having a lack of knowledge of modern history, creates the space in which all sorts of false agendas, false ideas can be planted. And it's done with some very slick public relations, rhyming chants from the river to the sea, or there is only one solution, intifada, revolution. They don't even know what that means. But that's what we're seeing, and it's taken off. It's taken off on the short sound bites of social media, particularly Graham, and that's what we're dealing with in Australia, Neil.
A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line, we can open talkback lines if you have a question or a comment. 1800 316 316. We're into what I think is just a very informative, and I'd even go so far as to say a heart-to-heart conversation with Dr. David Adler today, who's our special guest. He's president of the Australian Jewish Association. We're talking about Jewish Australians. We're talking about what they've endured and continue to endure since the terror attack 7th of October 2023. 1800 316 316. I want to take you into the deep end here for a moment, and some people might say this sounds a little unorthodox for a Christian to ask a Jewish leader these things, but let me ask you, and I'll put it out there, and for your response here, David, the trouble with Christians. We've got all of this history, 2,000-year Christianity history, and then, of course, all of our shared history when we're Judeo-Christians back to, Abraham and then beyond. What are your thoughts if I ask you, and quite openly, what's the trouble with Christians?
Well, Neil, to be honest, we don't really dwell or focus on the far past. We know that there were Christian groups in the Middle Ages that were very anti-Semitic. Obviously, the Inquisition is notorious in Jewish history. The expulsion from Spain, and there were also, a mixture in the Holocaust, but in modern times, we see a very good relationship with the bulk of the Christian communities around the world. Many of them are very pro-Israel and have provided wonderful moral and political support too, particularly in the United States. They've been very active, and that is so much appreciated. And even in Australia, since the 7th of October last year, there have been a number of Christian initiatives to stand with the Jewish community in combating anti-Semitism. And I can't tell you how much that is appreciated, because there are times when you feel vulnerable and isolated, and to have the support of our Christian brothers and sisters is very, very heartwarming and very needed. And on a broader political issue, with a number of forces gathering that are contrary to the interests of Western civilization, and I call them the isms, the socialism, communism, Islamism, are based on a set of values that are contrary to the Judeo-Christian ethics. We really need unity to support the values upon which Western civilization is founded. And I'm making no comment about one's religious observance. Everyone is on their own journey. But in terms of a value set that we want going forward for this country, there is no better value set for humanity to stand on than the combined Judeo-Christian ethics in my view, and we want Australia to be a free, liberal democracy based on those principles.
And I note from the AJA website, and listeners might like to look this up, politically the AJA is centre-right. That's the way you describe yourself, and certainly your description of those ways with a Judeo-Christian foundation. No doubt listeners might like to be checking out those values. Hey, let's take a call or two. 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation. Let's hear from Bernadette in Kingston in South Australia. I got you, Bernadette.
Yes, good morning, Neil. Good morning, David. Yes, I just wanted to encourage you, David, that even though it feels like it's overwhelming and everything, that there's lots of prayer going up for the Jewish community, the Christians all around the world who really feel, the trauma you're going through. And my condolences on the death of your family member. That must have been shocking. And I've actually been to Israel twice. Once with the prayer team, then with Vision Christian Radio, and I support Bridges for Peace, and they send money over and do what they can, and I pray for Israel, and Emmanuel Warby has her bit, and I pray when, So, look, I've been praying for the hostages and praying for the Jewish people all around the world. Feel their pain and their hurt, and, I just think it's heartbreaking to see it, but know that they're Christians that are praying for you every day, praying for the Jewish people around the world, and also in Israel with all the attacks. Just know that you're not standing alone, that there's people standing there beside you.
Bernadette, wonderful insight. David, a response for Bernadette?
Well, we're hanging our hopes on the many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people like Bernadette who are supportive, who don't want, vicious anti-Semitism in Australia, and who see that, there is one Jewish state in the world and it has a right to exist. And if you've been to Israel, I'm sure Bernadette would have observed that it is the only place in the Middle East where Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze, share facilities, transport, education, governance, the whole thing. So that's what we want, and I just reiterate the sort of sentiments that Bernadette has expressed are so much appreciated, and we hope there's many more like you.
Bernadette in Kingston, South Australia, thanks so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Let's take another call. Vince is in Brisbane. Hey, Vince, welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. Hi, David. David, look, there'd be a range of issues I'd love to raise with you, including the dubious Jewish Khazarian mafia theory, and also on the Arafat link with the KGB. But I think what I'd like to raise with you is I have compelling evidence that the anti-Semitic chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is even more overtly anti-Semitic. I think it is actually should be long live free Arab Palestine from its river to its sea. I found this out when I got an article from a Palestinian group writing in Germany, and they wrote this article in German, in English and in Arabic, and then they used that phrase in the title. It was about an incident in Berlin back in the 2nd of October last year, just 5 days before October 7th. And when I into Google, that's what it came out as. I think they've watered down the translation of it, perhaps maybe for naive English-speaking Western ears. Anyway, I'd like to know your thoughts.
I hope you heard that, David. It wasn't as easy to understand. I hope the line was clear, but different meaning in the Arabic to what we might even be seeing in the English translation from the river to the sea. Have you got a thought here, David?
Yes. It's not uncommon for statements to be made in Arabic and in English, and they're quite different. There are a number of organisations that monitor the Arabic media and expose it. There's one called PMW, which stands for Palestinian Media Watch, and there's another called Honest Reporting. And there are numerous examples where the English translation is watered down for the consumption of Westerners, and the Arabic words are much sharper. The slogan "From the river to the sea" undoubtedly means the annihilation of the Jewish state, and it has meant that, ever since the state of Israel, modern state of Israel, was created in 1948. And you might recall that until the Six-Day War, it was Egypt that occupied Gaza, and it was Jordan that occupied Judea-Samaria, which some people call the West Bank. And then the Palestinian Liberation Authority, the PLO, was created. Now, what exactly was it supposed to liberate, given that Egypt had Gaza and Jordan had Judea Samaria? And the only answer is that it was to liberate the remaining land from the river to the sea, which was the then boundary of the modern state of Israel. So that's what it means. It's often linked with the other slogan about intifada, and the interpretation of intifada also varies depending upon which media you read. In some English, it will read as, struggle or resistance, but in the Arabic, it's clear that intifada is a program for murderous terrorism, suicide bombers blowing up civilian buses, these sort of things that we saw in the first and second intifadas. So Vince is right. There is often a difference, and a significant difference, in the meaning from the Arabic to the English.
Vince in Brisbane, thanks so much for drawing attention to definitions and translations of some of these words that get used and bandied about in the media. Vince in Brisbane, thank you so much for your call. Let's come, and time is short, around what's happening today, David. As I understand it, Jewish leaders have taken the radical Islamic cleric Wissam Haddad to the federal court, has said some vile things about the Jewish community. Is this a new development, or is there more of this to come? Jewish leaders taking some of these outspoken clerics to court over their issues, the way that they're presenting those in a sort of a hate-filled way?
It is a new development, and it's an unfortunate development that Australian government and law enforcement authorities have failed to act on incitement. And we're all for free speech, but most reasonable free speech advocates have a red line, which is incitement of violence, incitement of hatred, and calling for the murder of Jews, and many other slogans and messages that create hatred and potential violence. I'll give you one insight that is not much made public. We've had a lot of meetings with counter-terrorism police. And I was in one meeting with the New South Wales Counter-Terrorism Police recently, face-to-face, and we were getting a whole range of threats, and unfortunately many of the threats, not all of them, but many of the threats were coming out of the Muslim community. So I asked the Counter-Terrorism Police, has there been anything in the reverse? Have you had any significant incidents that you have been concerned about that arose out of the Jewish community towards Muslims? And their answer was zero. This is a one-way street. And we're very, very concerned, Neil, that yes, we have to set a precedent, a legal precedent, but the risk of this rising in Australia is extreme. And one of the things that's made it extreme is the immigration policy and bringing thousands of people from Gaza. Everyone knows that Penny Wong has issued a few thousand visitor visas, so-called. In the news in the last week is the cancellation of one of those visas because of links to prescribed terrorist organisations. It is inevitable that we have been importing those that are highly anti-Semitic. They have had 2 generations of brainwashing, indoctrination. Gaza is probably the most high-risk place on the planet currently from which to import people, and that's what we're doing, and Australia's doing it at a greater rate than any other country. So, yes, a precedent needs to be set with a couple of their leaders, and hopefully it will encourage Australian law enforcement authorities to actually do their job.
And an interesting and important initiative to do that, to look for a legal precedent. And in order to do that, you've got to be able to take a cleric to court. Hey, let's take another call. 1-800-316-316. Alex is in Melbourne. Hey, Alex, welcome.
Oh, hello, Neil and Mr. Adler. Neil, you mentioned the question, what's wrong with Christians? Well, I think what's wrong with everyone is because not only Christians, but even the Jewish people, it's the way we read and accept God or not accept God's word, because I can read two passages here from one passage from the Old Testament where it says Moses says, "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken." And it's quite, and if you don't, well, it's not the best outcome. And then in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, we read that Nicodemus came. The same came to Jesus by night and said unto him, "Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest except God be with him." So I believe these passages and I believe the history of the Word of God, because I've tasted as it is, Isaiah, taste and you will see how good God is. And that's the only way I understand it anyway.
Good thought there, Alex. And oftentimes context is so important, isn't it? Because Jesus, the one whom the Christians follow and worship, was a Jew, and all of the Gospels that we read were in the Jewish context. They were spoken to Jewish people. David, I wonder if you've got a response at all for Alex?
Well, I will say this, that there is a couple of interweaving principles in Judaism that I think you can relate to from Alex's message, and that is translated into English, love your fellow as yourself. So that you're supposed to respect and love and embrace your fellow, even if he's not the same as you. And that's what we do. And perhaps this is a principle in which Judaism might be a little bit different to Christianity. We say you do not have to be Jewish to find a place in heaven. You have to be a good person. And what the definition of a good person is a different discussion. So we don't seek to bring non-Jewish people into Judaism. Rather, we encourage people to be good and do the right thing and live good lives. I think those principles are really important, and I think that there is a lot more in common between Christianity and Judaism, obviously, than there is differences, but to the extent that there are differences, I have no trouble living with them and respecting them. We know that we're in a country that has the Union Jack as its flag, part of its flag, and the Union Jack consists of a number of crosses, and they're there for a reason. And I support the Australian flag with those symbols on it.
Wonderful. Alex in Melbourne, thank you so much for your insight. And, today is not a day for, in one sense, the Jewish community proselytising the Christians or the Christians proselytising the Jewish community. But there's so many things that we have in common. One of those, of course, being the expectations of where things are headed. Obviously, there are things that are happening today uncomfortable things. We might even point to, a big overall context. The Bible predicting that Israel would return to her land, and even through persecution. Thinking of Jeremiah chapter 16. I don't know whether you're so familiar with that passage. You probably are. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. Jeremiah 16 verse 15. And it goes on to say, God will use fishermen and hunters to pursue his people back to Israel. Interpreted as even persecution being used to restore the nation of Israel. Do you have any sort of perspective on that, David?
That is a fascinating observation, Neil, and we now have basically just over half the world's Jews living in Israel. There's still many million in America. But interestingly, it is indeed conflict which drives Aliyah sometimes, sometimes not. But even since the 7th of October, there has been a considerable number of people, Jewish people, moved to Israel. And I've got to tell you, frankly, that for reasons that might not be positive, there are some people in the Jewish community observing what's happened in Australia. And I know a few that have left or are planning to leave, thinking that Australia might have reached a tipping point as well. So fishermen, hunters, persecution, whatever it is, many people have established family and personal ties, so we don't pressure anyone, but would certainly support any of our Jewish community who think that their destiny lies in the land of Israel.
And time has run out, David, and I really appreciate hearing your heartbeat this morning and recognising too that there are a number of Christian organisations that really have a focus on support for the nation of Israel. And to the point, as you're saying, that there are Jewish people in Australia that would like to make a move towards their homeland, the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, and of course that process called Aliyah, people making that homecoming to their land. David, we have run out of time, but let's do this again sometime soon. Just fascinated and enjoying hearing your heartbeat today. David Adler is president of the Australian Jewish Association, popular speaker, of course, an advocate for Israel. You can connect with David at jewishassociation.org.au. jewishassociation.org.au. Dr. David Adler, thanks so much for sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.